Thank you, Praveen.
Any questions to Dr. Pramod? Please post. I know we took a longer time, but it's worth. You can try that. He has shown hands-on. So, yeah, I would like to invite next guest speaker, Alex Goma. Uh, Alex, how are you after a long time?
Yeah,
Nice
good
to see you
morning.
again, sir. Sorry,
Yes.
keep you waiting. That we just got delayed by our sessions because it's a back-to-back sessions. Sorry for that, but you will get your time slot, whatever. So welcome, Alex Goma, for the show. So we are talking about integrated business planning, the topic. Just to give a short, brief introduction, Mr. Alex Goma is a seasoned FMCG business leader with multi-country African experience, specialized in commercial strategy, route to market execution, distribution management, and customer service and logistics. So he's a very senior leader in African continent and African region. And thank you, Alex, for joining the session again all the way from Africa. So thank you very much. Over to you, sir. So if you want to share screen, yeah, you take help from our. Yeah, we can see the screen. Yes. Yeah,
All right.
perfect.
So,
Perfect.
thank you, everyone. Well, it's morning here in Nigeria. I guess it's afternoon in India and wherever you are. What I want to
Can
do
you
is
click on the
share.
hide button, hide on the pop-up, so that you can your presentation? Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
All right then. So, what I'm going to do is share on integrated business planning, but I'm going to put it more around looking at how you build agility with the process. So it's not just the process, it's how you master this in high volatile markets where you have a high level of fragmentation. So I'll just summarize what the process is and then how do we adapt this to Africa's reality and what are certain pillars that are critical for you to understand when you're putting this. And I think this is not just about African reality. I think it's also for any other market where you have a high level of fragmentation and volatility. And then I'll share example of case study, which is real life in a former business I was in, and then how do we bring this to life. But basically, what is integrated business planning? It's a process where everything within the business is brought together in an integrated manner to ensure that you deliver your overall business objectives. And usually this will start with the overall company strategic plan, um, either a 5 or 10 year plan, which is then broken down into the annual plan or the operational plan. And then within this plan, you then have to look at the various processes. How do you plan your commercials from a brand sales perspective? How do you plan your supply planning, either from a manufacturing, delivery, logistics perspective? And how do you make the business decisions, right? How do you optimize the kind of decisions that you have after seeing the impact of the various choices that are available to you? And critically, how do you integrate every part of the business that is not customer facing or supply facing into the business so you can see the impact? So this allows you to focus on the business priorities rather than looking at functional objectives. And how is IBP different from S&OP? Because sometimes a lot of people will interchange between S&OP and IBP. I think basically S&OP primarily is focused on balancing supply and demand to make sure that you have the right efficiencies and alignment, and therefore you can serve the market better. The difference with IBP is that IBP takes that and then also integrates all the other elements of your strategy, be it your sustainability plan, be it your people plan, be it your IT infrastructure, and all the other business enablers, including change management, to make sure that you can see the holistic impact on your business and therefore you drive this. Now, IBP requires integration of systems, and in a lot of instances, what you find is, okay, in theory, you have the data, and today with technology, you can integrate all of these things, and therefore, in a lot of markets, you have stability. The levels of variability and change is very, very small, and therefore you can plan using the data. You can plug in systems, and therefore it becomes a self-fulfilling process. The challenge with Africa is that the reality is VUCA is every day. So volatility is not an input. It's not something we consider. You have to consider it as an input. It is not an interruption. It's not something that just happens by accident. Volatility is part of every day. Right? You can have 6 months of where things are stable, and then all of a sudden you have disruption from different areas. It could be currency, it could be finance charges, it could be insurrections, it could be weather, and all of this that drive that. So the key challenge is, how do we take the theory and apply it? And some people will tell you that, look, the 5-year plan doesn't work. Why do you need a 5-year plan when I can't predict the next 3 to 6 months? Why do I need a 2-year or 3-year operational plan? I think you still need that, because that's the spine that will form the spine or the guardrail for your planning. But then you have to bring the ability to be elastic, so you don't miss the principles and the objectives that having the right kind of IBP brings to your business. But then how do you infuse what the reality is? So, and part of what you call the Africa premium is that high fragmentation will lead to high cost. If you look at more matured markets, it's very easy to have your business centered around large stores, chain stores, and where the data from the stores are integrated with your supply system. So it's very easy to do things like just in time. It's very easy for you to say, okay, you can spot the demand, you can see shifts in demand. In Africa, there's a huge level of fragmentation, and usually you have intermediaries to help you manage that. So you see elements of the modern trade in Africa, but this is a small part. I mean, most parts, probably apart from maybe parts of North Africa like Egypt, Morocco, and Southern Africa, most of the other markets are highly fragmented, with the informal sector providing somewhere anywhere between 60 to 80% of the business. So traditional IBP is built for stability. What Africa requires is IBP, but that is elastic, and it allows you to look at that. Traditional IBP is predictive. You can plan based on historical data and some of the assumptions that you build into the system, right? For Africa, you need to have that, but you also need to now put in adaptive planning. What are the signals that we can look at and say, with these signals, we have an early warning sign that allows us to trigger what can affect the plan that we have. And for you to do that, there are certain pillars that you need to consider. I know for most supply chain systems, we will plan based on volumes, right? You have to start making a shift. Whilst we look at the volumes, to where you're actually looking at currency, especially given the rate of where you see devaluation. And sometimes you can have 1 or 2 years of stability, and all of a sudden you have sudden devaluation that happens. Second thing that is important is to start looking at how you manage your demand from a buy model perspective. So yes, we have a formal structure that takes into consideration all the data that we have and all the assumptions and everything that we put, but we also have another system that actually looks at what is the informal information that we can gather, what are certain behaviors that serve as triggers that we can then say, okay, if we put this side by side, it allows us to then look at what we need to have for us to execute as far as the system is concerned. You also have to consider infrastructure elasticity, right? Most systems try to find the fastest and the most direct route between your business and your customers. Typically, one route from the company or the factory to the retailer where possible, or through a certain, but the idea is to make sure that we can go as direct as possible. Just in time doesn't work in most parts of Africa, because you have to think about how do we manage for the fragmentation, how do we manage for the unforeseens, and therefore, and how do we manage for the black box of data that doesn't exist or can't be translated directly, to make sure that we build certain redundancies. Therefore, you need to have certain elasticity, and then there's a framework that you can apply that ensures that you're following the pillars of IBP, but at the same time, you're building in the tools that allow you to be agile and you can make quick decisions. Even in systems where you have linear kind of processes and some stability, one of the critical areas where I found IBP missed the track is in the decision making. Lots of times the systems exist, technology exists, the tools exist, but what I've seen is a failure of leadership to make the calls that they're expected to make, either because we're stuck in what we have always seen as in the past, or certain levels of decision making is not delegated downstairs to ensure that the people who are monitoring and driving the system and the process are the ones who are making the call. So we're just going to take some of these pillars into a slightly more detail and then continue. So when we talk about currency-centric planning, right, it's important to understand that foreign exchange and finance costs can break your business. You could have ordered your raw material today, exchange rate has been stable, but your payment terms means that we're going to pay probably maybe in 30 days or 60 days or 90 days. And when you're paying, you are paying at the cost of the exchange rate at the time of payment. So you've done your plan, you've made your inventory, you've shipped, you've sold. And then 6 months, everything is stable, and then there's a 30% devaluation. That means that your financial plans is already scattered. So what you have to think about is, how do we plan in replacement cost perspectives, not looking at historical cost or what is the cost that I have today. How should we, what are the markers we can see put in place to make sure that we can simulate decisions ahead of time, because you need to be able to make quick decisions, right? There are certain decisions about pricing that can be done immediately, but there are certain decisions about pricing that needs to be taken in steps. If I look at a country like Nigeria, for example, things like coinage and units of currency play a big role in your pricing. A simple example is, okay, the simple unit of Nigerian currency is naira, but you can't plan a price increase from 1 naira to 2 naira or 3 naira. It doesn't exist, because those currencies are hard to find. So your price increases typically will be 1 to 5 or 5 to 10 or 20 or 50 or even 100, because some of those smaller currencies might not even be existing in the market. So when you take price increases, it's not a 1%, 1.5%. It might be in multiples of those currencies that are available, right? So it means you need to understand that. And sometimes pricing decisions are then taken in a balance of, do I increase outright price or do I reduce the quantity of the product that I'm giving, so that I can, therefore, I'm charging the same price, but I'm giving less product, therefore I can make more. So what you see is simply a waterfall chart that shows, okay, my starting margin might have been 30%, and then all of a sudden, because I have a forex devaluation, it's hit me. There's a logistic lag in getting my products in because of some of the challenges of infrastructure. Interest rates have all of a sudden moved, and also some of the working capital costs as a result of this. Just sees what I had as initial 30% gross margin now looking like 5% gross margin. For me to counter that, then I need to have a pricing strategy and policy that is very agile. I need to look at how I source and where I can source quickly and how I move. What are some of the inventory buffers that I have to carry, despite the fact that, okay, there are certain lead times that are established? And then how do I synchronize with finance, especially treasury, to make sure that in our planning we can see that? So in traditional systems, you might not find the treasury person sitting in the room when you're making the decisions, but treasury has to be linked with your planning to make sure that, okay, whilst this is our desired gross margin, we've taken into consideration some of this so that when we're planning, we can actually bridge the gap between what we have and make sure that we can manage this in advance. So the impact of any sudden changes in finance will not impact us. The second pillar to focus on is on the bimodal demand planning. In SENA well-established systems, there's a lot of data available and you have systems that can mine this data. But in Africa, there's a gap, and which is a black hole between what you ship. For example, if you use distributors, what you ship to your distributors, you can have that data. You can see the data of their inventory. You can see the linkage. But what happens after it leaves them? Okay, a huge chunk of business goes through the informal market, open markets, and therefore some of those markets you don't have data points, and therefore you can't get the data back. So you have to make certain assumptions um, when you do that. So how do you integrate your informal sensing mechanisms into your planning? So your 5-year plan, your 18-month operational plan is a guide, your budget is a guide. What then happens is your informal sensors are now giving you pieces of data that you have to integrate. And this is where the big debates with the guys, especially if you're working in a multinational environment where the people sitting in the center who can't understand that the way it happens in their own areas or in most parts of the business is very different from here. And so when you start to put those kind of assumptions, right, it becomes difficult for you to be able to ensure that you have full-time product availability in the market, because you have to think and you have to make certain assumptions that are not necessarily what is standard for the rest part of the world. So you have to plan in replacement cost perspective, not historical cost. And this is where also there will always be a debate between marketing, sales, for example, and finance, because they're looking at the competitors, and the competitors might have different lead times, they might have different models of operating, and they might have situations where there's another party that is carrying some of this cost, and therefore their own speed to pricing is very different from yours. And so you might be a situation where you're pricing higher than the rest of the competitors in the market, but you have to do that if you have to take into consideration the fact that you have to focus on replacement pricing. You have to have very clear forex triggers. What are the things that show you? Sometimes you don't see these signs. There are instances where, the country for 4 or 5 years, forex has been more or less stable. You could predict. There's a period where the annual devaluation of the currency was anywhere between 10 to 15%. And this was for over 20, 25 years. And then all of a sudden, in 6 months, the currency goes and basically devalues almost 90% within 6 months. Now, how do you plan for that, where your history is showing the last 25 years it's gone? But there's certain triggers. And some of these triggers you start to see when the government is struggling to make certain payments. All of a sudden, there's a backlog of forex payments that should have happened that is not happening, right? There's certain spending that is happening. And meanwhile, at the same time, the government, for maybe political reasons, is still saying that, look, we're not going to devalue, we're not going, but every other indicator is telling you that there's devaluation. Some of the foreign equity investors are beginning to pull out their money. So it's showing in some of the stock market indicators or track. But these things most people don't link with their business, and therefore they can't see ahead of time that this is happening, and therefore you need to take into consideration when you see this. So How do you get the kind of data from your informal channels that allow you to then plug in and say, okay, we can actually manage the data in such a manner that is complementary, and we can therefore see what the real path is and what the secondary path is that allows us to adjust for that. Having that understanding allows you to then build infrastructure elasticity, because the theoretical model sometimes doesn't hold. In fact, in a lot of instances, and it's therefore good for you to challenge the trade-offs. Okay, what is the cost of me holding extra inventory versus the cost of lost sales? What is the cost of me planning ahead for pricing, and yes, taking a hit because I might struggle from the market and therefore I'm going to get a volume hit, but I am going to be financially efficient, and therefore I'm going to protect the profitability that I have. So just in time is an aspiration and is an ideal that you follow, but it remains a myth in a number of places. So you've got to do some strategic decoupling. It makes sense to ship direct from the factory to a certain location. Why should I have a secondary hub? Why should I have a regional demand center? It is necessary to ensure that I can manage for chaos that happens in certain regions. I can manage for speed to market if there are changes that have happened. I can manage for how I can grow even some of my smaller categories where I don't have scale to be able to build the to make sure that I can meet the demand that I have in the market. You've got to be looking at probability of your lead times rather than what seems to be ideal and then one off and trying to push that and trying to force that. So it just becomes a scorecard thing that we're looking at the scorecard and we're trying to measure what we think we would want to have. And in reality, we're failing to see that. Sometimes the way some of the measures of efficiency are done are then cooked to make them appear good, right? So and on the scorecard, it looks good, but the reality is that we're not. I've seen demand planning systems where on the operational dashboard, it looks as if they're okay, but in reality, they are not. Simple example, we collect cash, so the order has to be backed. And once the order is put in and we don't have stock, okay, we moderate the order to make sure that the order matches with what we have. So guess what? Your demand forecast accuracy then appears, right? Because you're meeting all the orders. No, you're not capturing the original demand and therefore you're not seeing that I am missing this out. So on paper, on the dashboard, where our order fulfillment is 95%. No, it's not. It's because we're adjusting the orders to cover for what we have, and then the customer makes the payment, and then we ship, and then when we start to track, it says we're fantastic. And one key example was a big player, one of the biggest consumer goods businesses that I was doing some work with. And when you look overall, the business seems to be doing well. But then when you start to break it into the subcategories, you find out that, okay, it's in the categories where they're very big, they're doing well because they could ship direct to some of their customers that have built scale over time. And because these categories are big, they have enough scale to make their shipments efficient straight from the factory into the big customers wherever they are. The challenge is that over the years, they've launched a number of key categories and they're not doing very well. And it is only when you start to disaggregate, you then find out that, okay, the demand for this, the customers for these categories have not been built to the point where they have these skills. Therefore, they're not efficient. And surprisingly, for a business with that kind of scale, they don't have regional hubs or a distribution center where they can integrate some of these demands for the smaller categories and therefore ship to them in a manner that is more efficient, because you're now doing cross-docking and you're able to ship combined loads to some of these distributors, and therefore you can actually start to build the infrastructure. So the data existed, the dashboards are, but because you're mining and matching your orders to what is available, they're losing sight of the opportunity until they started to dig down to say, you know what, maybe we need to create a regional hub. Maybe we need to get more data that is linked at even levels below what our key dealers are, to start to make sure that we can see that. And are there other pieces of data that we're measuring from outside to tell us that this is what is happening? And because they didn't focus on that, they lost a lot of mileage in some of those key areas. And even in the big categories, some efficiencies started to drop because bigger players that could compete and had the financial capital to come and compete in those categories where the big entered the market, and all of a sudden there are certain areas that they were underserving because those areas could not afford a full truckload directly, but they were not catching or seeing that demand was going. And other competitors started entering in those areas because they had more flexible ways of operating, and therefore they were able to start getting critical mass. And all of a sudden, they woke up one day and found out that midway into the year, these areas where we thought we had pent up demand, they were struggling to meet up with supply. All of a sudden, they were now struggling to create demand in these particular areas. So, important to understand and see the fact that, okay, you might need to build some elasticity in your infrastructure to make sure that you're able to deal with that. And then, of course, you need to have your framework adapted. So the business planning framework to suit the context of Africa or whichever market you're in, where there's a lot of volatility. So in terms of your intelligence systems, yes, we have the data that comes from ERPs, from all the systems that we put in to integrate the data, but what also do you have that is coming from the informal sector? So are there proxy signals that we can integrate into this to make sure that we can see that, and therefore we can start to act on the basis of this? How do we create physical buffers, right, to make sure that, okay, in our planning, we can take into consideration some of the elements that come in, and therefore we are able to build that elasticity into the way we plan and the systems that we have. How do we plan our financial layer? So things, triggers for forex, triggers for finance costs increasing, right? So that we can manage to do this. Again, simple example is moving from systems like where, yes, you have bank facilities that allow you to cover for urgent working capital needs, but with interest rates rising highly, businesses have seen that, oh, maybe a cheaper way of sourcing funds is to do commercial papers. Now, but one of the challenges is with commercial papers, okay, some of the rates are fixed. And then, like in Nigeria in the recent few months, right, you've entered into a commercial paper, the rates are fixed, but all of a sudden now interest rates are coming down because the exchange rate is coming down in a couple of things. Meanwhile, you already locked yourself into a 1-year CP. So again, what kind of terms, or when you're building things like this, how do you ensure that there's some flexibility that allow you to get out as quickly as possible, or you're watching the triggers early enough to say, wait a minute, there are certain changes that are happening, and therefore it doesn't make sense for us to get into a CP, because once we get in there, we're locked and we cannot take advantage of the benefits of lower rates that are coming and are happening in the market. And then, of course, at the top is then what are the kind of decision making, what's the cadence of your meeting structure for alignment, right, and making decisions. You may have the structure in the traditional model. You would probably meet once a month. Your weekly operational meeting has to create room for you to work in a war room kind of scenario. What are the things we look at? And actually, within the week, can we trigger a quick meeting where there's a change in where we can actually look at this and make decisions? Are there certain decision rights that have been delegated downwards? So rather than the exec having to meet, right, is there a framework where, okay, we can trigger something up to 10, 20% additional for inventory because we see the signs, and we don't need to come back together with everyone for us to get in a room to therefore make the decisions. But you have to build the capacity and the capability of the team underneath the executive layer to be able to take this kind of decisions, especially where you're doing business optimization. This is where that kind of decision right comes in. So all the other data that is coming from the infrastructure inequalities, port congestion, bad roads, escalation of insecurity, informal trade moving up and down, different rainfall patterns that affect the earning ability of the consumers, especially where there's a lot of agricultural impact on consumer cash and earning, and therefore affecting other sectors. All of these things have to be factored in to make sure that you adapt your IBP framework to suit the context of your market that is very highly volatile. So, simple example, one of the businesses where been, I think, early on, we started to see currency had been stable for a while, but we started to see some of these external triggers. And the decision was, okay, what are we going to do? And if this thing happens, is it possible? And so we decided to do modeling of the currency if it goes 100% devaluation within a period. What are some of the choices? Okay, what point will we price? What point will we make sizing changes for the product? Now, the sizing changes they're not straightforward, because one of the core components for making size for one of the big categories of the business, which was toilets, is the die sets. The lead times for die sets can take between 6 to 9 months. And if you don't have this already in the market, you're already too late, because the currency. Now it's a choice, because this CapEx investment, and how many do we plan for and keep and hold in stock. But scenario was planned, and then we took a decision to say, you know what, let's just make these die sets. If it doesn't work, maybe in 5 years' time, we might require them, right? But for now, we're just going to go ahead and buy them and make sure that they're in market. And then all the plannings, the price points, and whatever we're going to get. So we sourced these materials and parts, kept them in, and then all of a sudden, the crisis just happened. There was a new change in government. New change in government came with a new policy, and some of the policies then accelerated the currency devaluation. And whilst a lot of other businesses made forex induced losses because they didn't price for replacement, we actually started to do replacement pricing. We started to make these certain changes because we had the die sets in-house, so we didn't have a 6-month lead time to do that. And at the end of the year, the outcome was that we had actually, in the year where other businesses were complaining about forex losses, we actually had one of the most profitable years for us as a business. And that became a mindset going forward, that for everything that we have to do, we have to make this plan. So yes, your integrated business plan was there. Every year you review your 5-year plan, but you also have that running where you always manage your scenarios to make sure that it happens. So how do you bring this to life? I think for businesses, this is about bringing the market context into a norm in your business planning. So create the cadence that allows you for quick decision making. Where the gap has always been is in the decision making, is bringing some of that informal insight into the room and making those choices. What matters is winning, because you're able to constantly fill market demand despite the constraints of the market and some of the challenges. Identify the volatility triggers that are critical and set those trigger points for decision making. Grant decision rights over parameters like inventories to whoever is leading your business process or the business optimization leads. Pilot and run bimodal planning streams, okay, multiple scenarios. Identify what are some of the key data sources, proxy data that you can, and impute that into your planning process. And this allows you to therefore start looking at how you can plan everything from your infrastructure, some of the areas where you're going to have the buffers, and planning for elasticity, and then looking at the areas where you're going to shift and change, and also see the underlying changes in the patterns for what you see in the environment to ensure that you can make that. Once you start doing this, you can therefore keep the key elements of integrated business planning but you're ensuring that you're adapting those processes to meet the market context that allows you to deliver against your business objectives. So that's what I wanted to share. I'm ready to take any questions, if there are any.
Fantastic session. I think you elaborated it's much more than IBP. So
Yes.
you talk about complete the business scenario in the volatile environment. Okay. So how practically can be done this? So how the CEO, what is your advice to CEOs? Like
So
in a systematic way. It's a big complicated topic.
I
How
think the
they
first
can.
I think the CEO, first of all, has to see himself as an owner of the entire process. I think one of the things that CEOs do is an assumption that the process is working. And sometimes they don't dig in to just check to see that, okay, what are we missing and what are the gaps? When a business is doing well, a business doesn't look at what have we lost. So a simple example, okay, we've hit our numbers. What sales did we lose, and why did we lose that? Right. Constantly challenging the assumptions that we put into our business process and see, okay, how do we bring the informal in? I think if CEOs start to do that, you're now forcing because if you just focus on the overall result, you can be doing well, and but it doesn't hide that you're missing opportunities, or it doesn't hide that this thing is coming to bite you in future if you don't. So I think for me, that's the first step, is deciding and owning, and maybe asking the questions and saying, okay, the linkages that belongs to you. Now, who manages the process underneath is not yours, but you take ownership to challenge and ask the right questions. I've seen CEOs just want to see the dashboard that looks good for reporting sake, and
Mm,
therefore they don't challenge why it's not. I've been in
mm,
sessions where I'm supporting, so I'm observing as I'm asking questions, they're uncomfortable because the questions is forcing them to look at, oh, our business looks good. But I'm saying, yes, your business looks good because you're delivering, but your business has a lot of gaps that you're not answering, you're not facing. You're not willing to say, look, we're not as good as we are, but we're getting by, because if somebody else comes into the market that sees where we have a soft under, actually take us up. That's what I think that
mm,
needs to happen. Look at the systems that you have. So yes, I think the system that FTSE has, they're fantastic systems, right? If you focus only on the system, use the nuances of how do we bring the informal on in the behavioral patterns that we bring. So some of the qualitative factors, you can be too logical and you miss some of the informal linkages that show you that, look, there's something that is coming in the background. I'll give a simple example, right? Okay, in the last couple of months, food inflation is coming down in Nigeria, is driving inflation, overall inflation down, which seems fantastic. But it's great now. How has this food inflation arrived? Government has allowed importation of foodstuff into the
mm,
market, but it's creating a challenge, which means that the farmer today is basically saying that I can't compete if I farm locally. So I can't compete if I farm locally means that I can buy food cheaper, but I'm not creating income because I'm not farming.
mm,
Now, the action, you're going to start seeing the feedback around September, October, November, when you expect the harvest to start coming and the people have not planted enough because the input costs and whatever is not matching with what they see as the price of the commodity in the market today. So you might be in a different business and you're planning an upsurge in your demand. You have nothing to do with food. But the person who is planning, which is a huge part of the population, is not planting right now. And this is a planting season because the person doesn't trust that will I be able to sell and make money when it's time to sell. So all of a sudden, yes, food prices is coming down, inflation is coming down. You're thinking that I'll have an, but meanwhile, there might be 30, 40, 50% of your population that is rural, depending on farming, that is not generating, they're not making the input to ensure that you can get money. So when you see during the peak period for your demand, you would have built inventory because you want to cash in on the demand during
Mhm.
that period. All of a sudden, it doesn't materialize, and it's because you're not seeing something that is not directly linked to your business, but that you should be looking at. So that's a simple example.
I think that's perfect. I think that's the single most important thing every CEO should pay attention to it. Okay, so yeah, take the ownership and don't look at the fancy things. Look on
Yes,
the things which make sense for the
yes,
business.
yes, yes,
Don't go behind fancy things and lose the key
yes.
ingredient which makes you success. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much for joining the session on wonderful lecture. Very, very aggressive and very insightful. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you have, if there is any key thoughts if you want to share, Alex, before uh, closing the session, so please feel free. Any recommendation for the people? Ladies and gentlemen, give a big round of applause to Alex Goma. So, thank you very much, sir, for insightful lecture from all the way from Nigeria. So, thank you.